Arrogant bikers laugh at a teen. Moments later, they're begging for mercy. The sound of motorcycles roaring down the street echoed through the city, shaking the pavement as the group of bikers cruised by. The riders were loud, their bikes vibrating with power, and their confidence matched their engines. There were 6 of them in total, each one a towering figure in leather jackets, sporting tattoos that told stories of their wild lifestyles. They were a group that ruled the streets, fearless and unapologetic, known for their reckless attitude and disrespect for anyone they deemed beneath them. As the bikers turned the corner, they caught sight of a teenager standing at the bus stop. He was slender, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, looking out of place in the middle of the chaos that surrounded them. He didn't fit in with the fast-paced energy of the street, but the bikers were used to this, always looking for someone to pick on, someone to test their dominance. The leader of the group, Mark, a burly man with a long beard and a scar over his cheek, slowed his bike as they approached the teen. He looked the kid up and down, his lips curling into a mocking smile. Well, look at this," Mark called out, revving his engine just a little too loud, the sound vibrating in the kid's chest. "What do we have here?" A little kid, standing on the street, probably thinking he's too good for the world. "You lost, kid?" The teenager didn't flinch. He simply looked up, meeting Mark's eyes with an unwavering calm. "You talking to me?" the teenager asked, his voice surprisingly steady. Mark laughed loudly, the sound echoing in the street as his friends joined in, all of them circling around the teen. "You think you can just stand there and ignore us? What's your deal? You some kind of tough guy or just out of your depth?" The teen remained silent, but it was obvious to anyone watching that he wasn't backing down. Mark leaned forward, still sitting on his bike, his face just inches from the teen's. "Come on, topic. You got something to say?" Mark sneered, raising his voice, his tone dripping with mockery. "What are you going to do, huh?" The teen didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his hoodie, clearly unbothered by the group of bikers surrounding him. It was almost as if he wasn't even fazed by their presence. One of the other bikers, Jake, a tall man with tattoos covering his arms, revved his engine and grinned. "I bet he's too scared to talk. Ain't that right, kid? Scared to face a real man?" There was a long moment of silence before the teen spoke again, his voice cool but firm. "I'm not scared of you." The bikers exchanged looks, their laughter dying down. For a brief moment, it was as if the kid's words had hit them harder than they expected. Mark leaned back on his bike, his eyes narrowing. "Not scared, huh?" Mark said, a chuckle escaping his lips. "Well, you should be. You don't know who you're dealing with, kid." The teen's calm demeanor was starting to unnerve them. Why wasn't he reacting? Most people would have been scared, or at least show some sign of fear, but this kid, he was different. Jake revved his bike again, making it even louder. "I bet you're just waiting for your mommy to come pick you up, huh? Little boy like you doesn't belong here. You don't belong in the real world." The group laughed again, but their laughter was quickly interrupted when the teen stepped forward, his posture straight and unintimidated. "I don't need anyone," he said, his voice low, but with an edge of confidence. "You think you can bully me, but you're not getting the reaction you want?" Mark raised an eyebrow. He was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. "Oh, really?" he said, leaning in closer. "What's your name, tough guy? You want to show us what you're made of? You think you're better than us?" "I'm not here to prove anything to you," the teen replied. His eyes were steady, unfazed by the increasing tension. Mark's irritation grew. "You're nothing but a little punk. You think you can walk around here, talking like you're untouchable?" The biker gang had been used to getting what they wanted. They could control anyone, intimidate anyone. They were used to everyone cowering, backing down when they saw the leather jackets and the tough guy attitude. But this kid, this teenager, was different. Mark's pride was on the line now. He couldn't let this go. "You're in the wrong place, kid," he growled. "It's time for you to learn your place." With that, Mark stepped off his bike, and the group of bikers began to close in on the teen. Jake moved to the side, trying to flank the kid, while others blocked his escape. But the teenager didn't move. He wasn't afraid. He didn't even seem to care. Mark took a step toward him. "This is where you show us what you're made of, or we make you show us." In that moment, the teen didn't hesitate. Without warning, he grabbed the backpack from his shoulder and swung it around in a smooth, precise motion. It wasn't the usual fight move, but it was enough to catch Mark completely off guard. The weight of the bag hit him in the chest, knocking him back a step. The bikers were confused for a second, unsure of what just happened. It was fast, unexpected, and it completely threw them off. But that was just the beginning. Before anyone could react, the teen grabbed a bike lock from his backpack, something that looked like an ordinary object to the bikers, but in the teen's hands, it was a weapon. With precision, he swung it at Jake, knocking the biker's hands off the throttle. The bike fell to the ground with a loud crash. Mark stepped forward, furious, but the teen was ready. He moved swiftly, dodging Mark's attempt to grab him and landing a quick punch to his gut. The blow was sharp and fast, leaving Mark winded. The other bikers froze. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their leader was on the ground, gasping for air. The teenager was unstoppable, moving like he had been trained for this moment. Suddenly, the group of bikers, the ones who had spent their whole lives terrorizing the streets, were backpedaling. They didn't know what to do. The teen didn't stop there. With swift movements, he took down one biker after another. They were caught off guard, each move he made too fast for them to counter. They hadn't anticipated this at all. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. Mark, now on his knees, looked up at the teen, panting for breath. You really think you can just do this to us? The teen stepped forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. You were the ones who started this. You were the ones who mocked me, thinking I'd back down. One of the bikers, now clearly terrified, crawled backward on his knees. Please, man. We didn't know. We were just playing around. Please don't. The teen looked down at him, and with one final word, he said, "Beg." And at that moment, the bikers were on their knees, pleading for mercy. The once confident bikers were now scrambling, their pride shattered, begging the teenager for mercy. Mark, the leader, who had thought he was untouchable, now found himself on his knees in front of the very person he had mocked. The other bikers, once brash and full of bravado, were now humbled and pleading for a reprieve. The teen stood in front of them, his face calm but with a touch of disdain. His breath was steady, his movements slow and deliberate, as he sized them up. He wasn't looking to finish them off. He had already proven his point. He was not to be underestimated. Please? We didn't mean it, Mark gasped, his hands raised in submission. We were just messing around. We didn't know who you were. The teen crossed his arms, his eyes cold and piercing. Does it really matter who I am? You thought you could bully me because I look different, because I'm younger, because I don't fit your idea of strength? His words were sharp, cutting through the air with the same precision he had used in the fight. We get it, one of the bikers stammered, his face pale. We didn't know you were this strong, this skilled. Just, please, don't make us regret this. The teenager took a step forward, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. The bikers, still kneeling, flinched with every step he took. They were at his mercy now, and they knew it. You think I'm strong because of what I did to you? The teen's voice was quiet but firm. Strength doesn't come from physical power. It comes from respect, respect for yourself and for others. You didn't show me any respect, so I made you feel what it's like to be disrespected. Mark lowered his head, ashamed. His hands were still raised in a gesture of surrender, but the teen's words cut deeper than any punch or kick could. This wasn't just about losing the fight, it was about losing their dignity, their sense of control. The crowd that had gathered around them, curious onlookers, people who had seen the confrontation unfold, were silent. No one dared to intervene. The power had shifted, and they could feel it in the air. The once intimidating bikers were now the ones who had to ask for forgiveness. The teen surveyed the group one more time, his gaze scanning each of them, making sure they understood the lesson he was imparting. Get up, he said quietly. I don't want to see you on the streets again, bullying people who aren't as strong as you think you are. Show some respect, or next time, it won't be me you're dealing with. The bikers, still reeling from the defeat, scrambled to their feet. There was no pride left in them now. They had been humbled, defeated by a teenager who had shown them that true strength wasn't about bravado or intimidation. It was about integrity, respect, and self-control. They had learned their lesson the hard way. Mark, still panting, nodded. "We won't forget this. We'll change. We'll make sure this never happens again." The teen looked at him one last time, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I hope so. And next time you think about messing with someone, think about what happened today. Because not everyone will be as patient as I was." With that, the teen turned and began to walk away, his stride confident, his head held high. The bikers stood there for a long moment, still processing the humiliation they had just endured. There was no celebration for them, no pride left in their actions. All they could do was watch as the teen disappeared into the distance, his back straight, his presence radiating strength and dignity. As the teen walked away, a wave of realization swept over the bikers. They had spent their lives intimidating others, asserting their dominance, but in that moment, they had learned the hard way that brute strength wasn't the only measure of power. They had witnessed firsthand the kind of strength that came from calmness, self-discipline, and integrity. It was Mark who broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "We messed up. Big time." His usual cocky demeanor had been replaced with a somber tone. "We thought we could control everything, but we were just a bunch of bullies." One of the other bikers, Joe, who had been quieter throughout the whole ordeal, spoke up. "I thought we were untouchable, man. I thought we had everyone scared, and then that kid he paused, shaking his head. "That kid just showed us who was in charge." The bikers stood in stunned silence for a few moments, processing what had happened. It wasn't just about the physical defeat, it was about the humbling they had experienced. They had been shown a lesson that many of them had never considered before. Real strength comes from respect, not from fear. Mark looked at his gang, his voice quiet but serious. "We need to change, guys. I don't know how, but we need to change the way we operate. We can't keep acting like this. That kid, he wasn't afraid of us. He wasn't afraid of our reputation. He showed us that we don't control everything. It's not about intimidation." Joe nodded. "I get it. I don't want to be that guy anymore. The guy who thinks it's okay to just push people around. We've got to be better than this." Mark turned toward the others, his eyes serious. "We've got to show some respect, not just to each other, but to everyone. That kid, he taught us more than we ever knew about being strong. It's time we start respecting people, not scaring them." In the days that followed, the group of bikers did something that none of them had ever done before. They made amends. They visited local businesses where they had caused trouble, apologized to people they had once bullied, and promised to change their ways. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come without resistance. But slowly, the bikers began to realize that they could still maintain their sense of identity without relying on fear. As for the teen, he had no idea that the bikers had been reforming in his wake. He had simply done what he knew was right, standing up for himself and showing others that true strength came from within. He didn't seek revenge or humiliation, he simply wanted to teach a lesson, and in doing so, he had changed the way a group of hardened bikers viewed the world. Weeks later, the teen passed by the same street where the confrontation had happened. The bikers weren't there. Instead, he saw a group of people gathered around, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the day. It was a simple moment, but one that told him everything he needed to know. The bikers had changed, and the teen had become a quiet symbol of respect in the neighborhood. It wasn't the victory that mattered most, it was the lesson learned. He had empowered not just himself but others around him. He had shown them that true power came not from intimidation, but from standing tall and holding your ground, no matter the odds. And as he walked away, the sun shining on his face, he knew he had made a difference. The bikers had learned their lesson, and the streets felt just a little bit safer, all thanks to a teenager who had refused to back down. As the days went by, the teen's encounter with the bikers became a memory that slowly faded into the background of the bustling city. People continued to go about their lives, and while the bikers had been quietly changing, no one seemed to realize the ripple effect that had begun with that single, humbling confrontation. But for the teen, whose name was Ethan, the impact of that moment had stayed with him long after the bikers had left the streets. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, had proven not just to them but to himself that he was capable of taking control of his life. Ethan had always been the kind of person who preferred to stay in the background, away from the spotlight. He was the quiet one, the observer, the kid who never spoke much in school, who kept his head down and went unnoticed. But something had shifted in him during that confrontation. Something had awakened. He wasn't the same person anymore. He walked through the city, the streets now feeling different to him. It was as if he was seeing everything through a new lens, one that saw the world not in terms of fear or intimidation, but in terms of respect and understanding. A week had passed since the bikers had been brought to their knees, and Ethan's life had returned to a sense of normalcy. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big had changed. He had made his mark in the city, and for the first time, he felt as though he truly belonged. One afternoon, while Ethan was sitting at a cafe, working on a drawing in his sketchbook, he was interrupted by a familiar voice. It was a voice that had once been a source of mockery and arrogance, but now it had a different tone. "Ethan K." Ethan looked up, his eyes locking onto Mark, the leader of the bikers. Mark stood at the entrance of the cafe, his hands in his pockets, looking a little less intimidating than before. His once stern face was softened by something else, sincerity. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Mark? What's up?" Mark smiled, but there was an awkwardness to his expression. "Can I sit down?" Ethan glanced at the empty chair across from him, then back at Mark. He didn't know what to expect, but he nodded. "Sure." Mark walked over and sat down slowly, taking a deep breath. "Listen man, I owe you an apology. And I know it probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but I need to say it anyway." Ethan didn't say anything at first. He simply waited, his eyes never leaving Mark's face. He had been prepared for this moment, in some way. He had expected some form of apology from Mark, but the reality of it still caught him off guard. "You were right that day," Mark continued, rubbing his hands together. "We were out of line. I was out of line. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. You didn't deserve any of that." Ethan nodded, not quite sure what to say. "I don't think I really needed an apology. I just wanted to be left alone." Mark chuckled, though there was a sadness to it. "I get that. I understand why you didn't fight back, why you didn't give in to us. That was the hardest thing I've ever had to admit. That someone like you could bring a guy like me to his knees without ever throwing a punch." Ethan looked down at his sketchbook, his fingers running over the pencil strokes as if to focus his thoughts. "It wasn't about fighting, Mark. It was about showing that I wouldn't let you push me around. You guys got used to thinking everyone was afraid of you. And maybe I didn't act like the way you thought I would, but it wasn't about being tough. It was about standing up for myself." Mark seemed to absorb Ethan's words, his expression thoughtful. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, man. About how I've been living, how I treated people. You're right. I've been a bully. And I think we've all been. We think we control the streets, we think we're the toughest guys around, but you showed us that it's not about being the toughest. It's about respect. And we've been giving none of it." Ethan stayed silent, taking in Mark's words. He hadn't expected to hear this. The biker gang had always been fierce, and hearing Mark speak so openly about their shortcomings felt like a shift that Ethan never thought would happen. "You and your crew," Ethan said quietly, "you don't have to keep acting like that. You can choose to change, to be better than what you were. But it starts with you." Mark looked at him, his eyes filled with something that looked like remorse. "I know. And that's why I wanted to come here, to apologize. Not just to you, but to anyone I've ever wronged. I want to be different." Ethan nodded. "That's all you can do. You can't go back and fix the past, but you can change the future." Mark smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "I'm going to try. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm going to try." Ethan finally allowed himself a small smile. That's all any of us can do. The weeks that followed were a blur of change. Mark and his gang, once the most feared on the streets, began to take steps to make amends. They visited the people they had once intimidated, offering apologies and trying to right their wrongs. It wasn't always met with immediate acceptance, but they were sincere. And little by little, they began to earn the respect they had once lost. Ethan continued on his path, still drawing, still working hard to become the best version of himself. He wasn't seeking out any more confrontation, and he didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to live his life peacefully, knowing that he had proven to himself that he was strong enough to handle anything that came his way. One evening, as Ethan was walking through the city, he passed by a group of bikers on the corner. For a moment, he wondered if it was Mark and his gang, but as he got closer, he saw that it was them. They were no longer the same group of men who had once mocked him. They were smiling, joking, and talking, but there was a sense of mutual respect in the air. Ethan kept walking, but this time, he felt no fear, no anxiety. He had done what he needed to do, and he had changed the way they saw the world. As he walked on, a thought crossed his mind. He had taught them something, but in a way, he had taught himself too. The real strength didn't come from physical power or intimidation. It came from being able to stand firm, to live with integrity, and to respect those around you. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was walking the streets as a person who had earned his place. And no matter what happened next, he knew he was ready for it. As time passed, the change in Mark and his gang became more evident. They were no longer the intimidating bikers who roamed the streets causing trouble. Instead, they became more like the unofficial guardians of the neighborhood. People who had once feared them now found themselves respecting them, not because they were afraid, but because they had earned it. Ethan continued to watch from a distance, not fully understanding the extent of the transformation that had occurred. He had walked away from the situation that day, content with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. But he never imagined that the bikers, the very ones who had mocked him, would turn their lives around and start changing for the better. One day, as Ethan was walking through the park, he saw Mark again, sitting on a bench by himself. The older man's face was lined with worry, a far cry from the confident, arrogant man who had taunted him only weeks earlier. Ethan paused for a moment, unsure whether to approach. He didn't need to be friends with Mark, but something inside him told him that this moment might be important. Slowly, Ethan walked up to the bench, and Mark looked up, startled to see him. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer than usual. "How's it going?" Ethan sat down on the bench next to him, not saying anything at first. He had no agenda. He simply wanted to see how Mark was doing. "You doing all right?" Ethan finally asked. Mark nodded, but there was a certain heaviness in his eyes. "Yeah. I mean, we're doing all right, but it's been tough. The others, they're still adjusting. They're still trying to change, you know? I think they feel like they owe something to the people they've hurt." Ethan nodded, understanding the burden Mark was describing. "Change is never easy," he said. "I think it's harder for some people than it is for others. But the fact that you're trying shows you're on the right path." Mark let out a long breath. "I didn't expect you to say that. I thought you'd be all." He paused, realizing he couldn't finish the sentence. "You were different that day. You weren't scared. You weren't trying to show us up. You just stood there." Ethan looked down at his hands, unsure how to respond. "I just didn't want to be bullied anymore," he said quietly. "I knew what you guys were doing and I didn't want to give in. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to be left alone." Mark looked at him, a flicker of something soft in his eyes. "You taught me something that day, Ethan. I don't know if you realized that, but you did. I used to think the world worked in one way. You either beat people down or you got beaten. But you showed me that it's about respect. You don't have to throw a punch to show you're strong." Ethan felt a sense of warmth spread through him as he heard Mark's words. He had always known that the true strength of a person didn't lie in their ability to physically overpower someone. It was about being emotionally strong, mentally resilient, and standing up for what was right without fear. "I guess that's the point," Ethan replied. "You don't have to fight everyone. Sometimes, the hardest thing is walking away. You showed me that too." Mark laughed softly, though there was a sadness to it. "I used to think strength was about being the loudest, the toughest, the one everyone was afraid of. But you know what? I've learned the hard way that respect is worth more than fear. You can scare people for a while, but eventually, they stop being afraid. What you're left with is nothing. Respect, on the other hand, respect lasts." The two of them sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversations settling in. Ethan looked over at Mark, noticing for the first time how tired the older man looked. The years of running wild, of living a life based on fear and intimidation, had clearly taken their toll. "So what now?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "What are you going to do?" Mark glanced at him, then at the horizon. I don't know, honestly. I'm still figuring it out. But I've been trying to make things right with the people I've hurt. It's a long road, but I think we can get there. I'm starting to see a different way of living, a better way. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon as well. I think you'll get there. You're already on the right track. Mark smiled at him. You know, Ethan, I didn't expect to learn this much from a kid. You've got a lot of wisdom in you. Ethan shrugged modestly. I just figured out how to not get bullied, he said with a smile. But inside, he knew that the wisdom he had gained didn't just come from avoiding fights. It came from learning to stand his ground, to face fear head-on, and to never give in to the pressure of those who thought they were in charge. Days turned into weeks, and Mark and his gang continued to work on their personal growth. They had begun volunteering at local charities, helping with community projects, and apologizing to those they had wronged. Though their efforts were met with a mixture of skepticism and acceptance, they didn't stop. They knew they had to earn back the trust they had lost. One evening, while walking home from school, Ethan passed by a group of people gathered in the park. He recognized one of the bikers, Joe, the quietest one of the gang. He was sitting on a bench, talking to a group of teenagers, his voice calm and measured. Ethan stopped for a moment, watching from a distance. Joe was no longer the intimidating figure he had once been. He was now helping the younger kids with their schoolwork, answering questions with patience and kindness. Ethan smiled to himself, knowing that Mark and his crew were making real, lasting changes. They were no longer the bullies of the street, they were becoming something better. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was clear that they were on the path to something more meaningful. A few months later, Ethan found himself walking through the city again, this time on his way to meet a friend. As he passed the park, he saw Mark and his gang again, but this time, they weren't intimidating anyone. Instead, they were sitting on the benches, talking to a group of younger kids, giving advice, and sharing stories of how they had turned their lives around. Ethan stopped for a moment, observing them from a distance. He knew that the change hadn't been easy for them, but he could see the genuine effort they were making. The bikers had gone from being feared to being respected for the way they were using their experience to help others. As Ethan walked away, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The streets that had once seemed full of danger and intimidation now felt a little bit safer, a little bit more respectful. And though he knew there was still much work to be done, he was proud of the changes he had witnessed. He had done more than just stand up for himself that day. He had started a ripple effect that had changed the lives of those around him. And in the end, that was the true measure of strength. As the days went by, the changes within Mark and his gang became more apparent. They were no longer seen as the fearsome bikers who ruled the streets with an iron fist. Instead, they began to transform into figures of guidance and mentorship, especially for the younger generation. The teens who had once looked up to the bikers as role models were now starting to see them in a different light. A light that was less about intimidation and more about wisdom and respect. Ethan continued his own journey, finding strength in the peace he had cultivated. But the effects of that fateful encounter with the bikers were more far-reaching than he had ever imagined. Not only had he stood his ground, but he had also sparked a change that was slowly but surely beginning to impact the entire community. One afternoon, as Ethan walked down the street, he overheard a conversation between a couple of older teenagers. They were talking about the bikers, and the tone of their voices was different from the usual gossip. I saw Joe helping out at the community center last weekend, one of the teens said. He was showing the little kids how to fix bikes. It was kind of surprising. Yeah, I know, the other teen replied. I thought those guys were supposed to be tough, but they're starting to do some serious work around here. I heard they even donated money to the shelter. Ethan smiled to himself as he listened to the conversation. This was exactly the shift he had hoped for. People were beginning to see Mark and his gang not as a threat, but as a group of men who had learned from their mistakes and were trying to make amends. As the weeks went on, Ethan's life began to settle into a routine. He still spent time drawing and honing his skills, but now he also found himself reflecting on the changes that had unfolded. Every time he passed by Mark or one of the bikers, there was a sense of calm respect that hadn't been there before. They were no longer the intimidating figures they had once been. Instead, they were part of the community, just like everyone else. One evening, as Ethan was walking home from a meeting with his friend, he passed the local diner, a place he frequented after school. As he approached the door, he saw a familiar face sitting inside, a face he hadn't expected to see. It was Mark, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee, chatting with the waitress behind the counter. Curious, Ethan stepped inside. Mark looked up as he entered, his expression softening when he saw him. "Ethan," Mark greeted him, motioning to the seat beside him. "Come sit. I was just having a chat with Julia here. She runs the place." Ethan hesitated for a moment but decided to join him. The awkwardness from their previous encounter had long since faded, but it still felt strange to share a table with the leader of the bikers who had once been so intimidating. "Hey, Mark," Ethan said, sitting down. "How's it going?" "It's going well," Mark replied with a smile. "I've been keeping busy, helping out at the community center, meeting new people. It's been a lot of work, but it feels good." Julia, the waitress, nodded in agreement. "It's nice seeing Mark change, honestly. He's not the guy I used to know. Now he actually stops by to talk to people, helps out with the kids. It's been a nice change of pace." Ethan couldn't help but smile. It was clear that Mark had genuinely made an effort to change his ways, and the impact was starting to show. "I think it's great," Ethan said. "You guys are making a difference. People are starting to see you in a whole new light." Mark nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I didn't realize how much I was missing before. The people we hurt, the lives we affected, it all comes back, you know? But it's never too late to change. I'm still trying to make things right." Ethan leaned back in his seat, considering Mark's words. "I think you're doing it the right way," he said. "It's not about erasing the past, it's about learning from it and being better moving forward." Mark smiled, his expression sincere. "That's exactly it, Ethan. I've made plenty of mistakes, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for them." Despite the progress Mark and his gang had made, there was still one challenge left: the community's skepticism. While many people had accepted the bikers' change, there were still some who couldn't forget their past transgressions. Ethan knew this, and he could see it in their faces when they spoke to Mark or one of the other bikers. One day, while Ethan was working at a local coffee shop, he overheard a conversation between a couple of regulars. They were discussing the bikers, and it was clear that some people still couldn't shake their past reputation. "I don't know," one of the men said, shaking his head. "I don't care what they say about how they've changed. Those guys were trouble. They don't just turn that off." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew the bikers were still facing challenges, and while they had come a long way, there were still people who saw them as the same thugs they once were. The next time he saw Mark, he decided to speak up. They were sitting together in the diner again, and this time, it was just the two of them. "Mark," Ethan began, hesitating slightly. "I've been hearing people still talk about you guys, about how you used to be. I think they're still skeptical, you know?" Mark looked at him, his expression serious. "I know. It's not easy, Ethan. People don't forget that quickly. But all I can do is keep showing up, keep doing the right thing. It's going to take time, but I'm willing to put in the effort." Ethan nodded. "You're doing the right thing. But sometimes, people need more than just words. They need to see you in action." Mark smiled slightly. "Yeah, I think I know what you mean." Ethan leaned forward, his voice a little quieter. "Maybe it's time to do something big. Something that shows everyone you've truly changed. You've already made progress, but you need to prove it to those who still doubt you." Mark's eyes sparkled with recognition. "I think you're right. I'll think about it." Mark wasted no time. In the days that followed, he and his gang began planning something special, a community event designed to show everyone just how much they had changed. It wasn't about showing off or seeking validation. It was about giving back and proving that they were no longer the men they used to be. The plan was simple but ambitious. Mark and his gang, along with some local volunteers, would host a free community barbecue, where everyone, whether they had been a supporter or a critic, was invited to come together and break bread. The idea was to create a space for conversation, for sharing stories, and for building the trust that had been lost all those years ago. When the day of the event arrived, Ethan found himself walking through the park again, just as he had the day of the bikers' initial challenge. But this time, there was no tension in the air. There was no fear, There was only the sound of laughter, the scent of grilling food, and the buzz of a community coming together. Ethan made his way to the picnic area, where Mark and the gang were already setting up tables. As he approached, Mark saw him and waved. "You made it," Mark called out, his voice cheerful. Ethan smiled and walked over. "I wouldn't miss it," he said. "You guys have done a lot for this neighborhood. I'm proud of you." Mark smiled back, clearly grateful. "We're just getting started. This is our chance to show everyone that we're more than the people we used to be." Ethan watched as people began to gather, exchanging smiles, shaking hands, and starting conversations. The bikers, once feared and hated, were now seen as a part of the community. They had proven themselves, not through words, but through action. And as the sun set on that day, Ethan knew that this was the beginning of something truly transformative. As the community barbecue progressed, Ethan noticed something incredible. The people who had once given the bikers wary looks, the ones who had crossed the street to avoid them, were now chatting freely with them. There were no walls between them anymore, no judgment based on past actions. The bikers were smiling, laughing, and engaging in genuine conversations, proving that they had truly changed. Ethan could see the transformation in their faces. Mark, who had once been a leader driven by fear and dominance, was now a man of purpose, someone who had learned the value of respect. The others in the gang, too, had undergone their own personal shifts. Joe, the quietest one, was helping children with their bikes, teaching them how to fix flat tires and adjust gears. Jake, who had been the most intimidating of the group, was sitting at a table with a group of older women, telling jokes and sharing stories of his travels. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a far cry from the day they had all first met, when the bikers had mocked him and tried to intimidate him. Now, they were the ones putting themselves out there, trying to prove that their past didn't define who they were becoming. As Ethan walked through the park, he noticed a few familiar faces from the neighborhood. There was Julia, the waitress from the diner, chatting with Mark about the progress they had made in the community. There was Mr. Thompson, the local store owner, who had always been skeptical of the bikers. And standing near the grill, Ethan spotted his father, looking around at the gathering with a bemused expression. Ethan approached his father, who was busy grilling some burgers. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said with a smile. His father looked up, a grin spreading across his face. Hey, son. This place looks different, huh?" Ethan nodded. "It's like night and day. I never thought I'd see Mark and his gang doing something like this." His father laughed. "Yeah, I'll admit I was skeptical at first. But seeing them now, talking with people, helping out, they've really turned things around." Ethan paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere. "I think it's more than just this barbecue. I think they're showing that people can change, that they don't have to be stuck in the past." His father nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I think we all have a tendency to judge people by their past, but we forget that they're not defined by their mistakes. We all have the chance to change." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride wash over him. His father was right. The bikers had shown the entire community that change was possible, that redemption wasn't just a word. It was something people could earn through actions, not just promises. As the evening wore on, Ethan stepped away from the gathering for a moment of solitude. He walked toward the edge of the park, where a small pond sat quietly beneath the twilight sky. The stillness of the water mirrored the calm that had settled inside him. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment. The confrontation with Mark and the bikers, his own personal growth, and the way the community had come together. He had never imagined that his decision to stand up for himself would lead to such a profound change, not just for the bikers, but for everyone around him. Ethan had learned that real strength wasn't about fighting back or proving someone wrong. It was about finding the courage to be yourself, to stand firm in your beliefs, and to show others that kindness and respect were the true measures of power. He had taken that lesson to heart, and it had shaped the way he saw the world. As Ethan stood there, lost in thought, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Mark approaching, his expression thoughtful but content. "I thought I might find you out here," Mark said, his voice calm but carrying an air of satisfaction. "Everything going all right?" Ethan smiled and nodded. "Yeah, just taking it all in. It's been a crazy few weeks, hasn't it?" Mark laughed softly. I don't think any of us expected things to change like this. But I'm glad they did. You were the one who started it, you know? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Me? I didn't do anything. You guys did all the hard work. Mark shook his head. Oh. You're the one who showed us what it meant to be strong. You stood up to us, and in doing that, you made us see ourselves differently. You were the catalyst we needed to start changing. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him at Mark's words. I didn't think of it like that. I just didn't want to let you guys push me around anymore. But I'm glad you guys are turning things around. Mark nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. We wouldn't have made it this far if it weren't for you, Ethan. You didn't just show us respect. You showed us that there was more to life than just intimidating others. And now, we're learning to live for something greater. Ethan smiled, a sense of gratitude welling up inside him. I'm glad to hear that. I just hope you all keep it up. Keep making the right choices. Mark clapped him on the shoulder. We will. You've got my word. The event continued well into the evening, and as the crowd began to thin out, Mark and his gang remained, talking to those who were still lingering, offering final words of advice and support. It was clear that the night had been a success, a sign that their hard work had paid off. Ethan stayed until the very end, watching as Mark and the bikers cleaned up the area, making sure the park was left better than they had found it. He knew that their work was far from over, but he could also see that they had taken the first steps on a long and difficult journey. As the sun set behind the horizon, Ethan made his way to the park exit. He felt lighter than he had in weeks, a sense of fulfillment filling his chest. He had stood up for what was right, not just for himself, but for the entire community. And in doing so, he had shown that even the most intimidating figures could change, could grow, and could become something better than they had ever been before. He walked home that evening, knowing that he had contributed to something much larger than himself. His quiet act of standing up for himself had inspired change, not just in the bikers but in the entire community. And as Ethan entered his house, he smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest impact came not from grand gestures, but from simple actions, from showing respect, from choosing peace, and from having the courage to face your fears.